Hello, welcome to this online dialogue organised by the ISD, which focuses on the recently concluded Agreement on Fisheries Subsidies at the World Trade Organization and on what the next steps are in the implementation of this agreement. So my name, for those of you who haven't met me, is Alice Tipping, and I lead ISD's work on trade and trade policy generally. I'm delighted to say we have about 160 people who've registered to join this webinar. They will probably be joining in the course of the next hour or so. But what's really interesting, I think, is that this webinar, unlike many that the ISD has run that was sort of members only for WTO members, this is specifically designed to be relevant to a very wide range of people, including WTO members, government officials, representatives of the academic and scientific communities, and also the general public. So welcome to you all. Thank you very much indeed for joining this discussion, and I hope you find it useful. So by way of very brief background, as all of you will be aware by now, last month on the 17th of June, WTO members, so governments represented at the World Trade Organization, reached an agreement after more than 20 years of negotiation on a new treaty, a legally binding treaty that will govern the subsidies that they provide to their fishing fleets. And to put this agreement in context, academic estimates suggest that around $22 billion of taxpayer funding is provided every year to fishing fleets, but provided in forms that increase fishing capacity or can increase fishing capacity. And this despite the fact that over a third of global fish stocks, the FAO tells us, are already overexploited. And despite the fact that the World Bank has told us a few years ago that the world's fishing fleet is already 2.5 times bigger than it would need to be to fish the world's resources, the fishing resources, sustainably. So this was a big issue. This was a major sustainable development challenge and will remain so. Reaching this agreement is, I think, a real achievement. And it's a real achievement for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because fishing is a major source of employment and a major source of food security in many places. And fishers are often, not always, but often quite politically powerful. And on the other side, subsidies are amongst the most sensitive of all trade policy tools. So what we have here is an agreement that deals with a particularly sensitive policy tool in a particularly politically and economically sensitive sector. So these were difficult negotiations. They were grueling. They went overnight for several nights in the week of the 13th of June. And a lot was achieved. But as we're also going to hear, some important things weren't achieved. Some important things had to be left for later. Negotiators found about halfway through the week that they had to leave for later important parts of the rules that they had text on going into this meeting. So it is a remarkable achievement, but it's not an unvarnished success. And it's important, I think, to be clear about what's in the rules and what's out and what the next steps are. So we have 4 speakers who will walk us through exactly those questions. We're going to hear first from my colleague Tristan Irschlinger, who has followed these negotiations over many, many years, and who has provided both technical advice and support to the negotiators throughout the process. So Tristan is going to tell us a bit about what's in the agreement, so what governments managed to reach agreement on, and he's also going to point out what was left out, so what they didn't manage to reach agreement on and what remains to be discussed next. We're then going to hear from Isabel Jarrett, who's manager of the Reducing Harmful Subsidies project at the Pew Charitable Trusts. And the Pew Trusts were instrumental in building both the evidence base and in public support for this agreement. So it'll be interesting to hear her assessment of what was achieved and what was not achieved. We're then going to hear from Professor Rashid Soumaila, a Killam professor at the University of British Columbia, who, like Tristan, has been working on subsidies issues for many, many years. That $22 billion estimate that I put at the beginning of my opening remarks is his estimate, because he's worked with colleagues on developing not just a comprehensive database and estimates of fishing subsidies, but also working at communicating the need for reform of these fisheries subsidies around the world. So we'll hear his slightly more academic, perhaps, perspective on what was agreed and what was left behind and what matters. And then we're going to move to a very operational part of the discussion. And we have the benefit of John Pearce joining us from sweltering London. So thank you, John, John is principal consultant at MRAG, which is a marine policy consultancy based in London. And John actually delivers a lot of technical assistance and support to implementation of international agreements relating to fisheries. So we've asked him to give us a few thoughts about what happens next in terms of the implementation of this agreement. So with that, I will finish my opening remarks, and I'm delighted to hand the floor next to my colleague Tristan. Go ahead, Tristan.
Thanks a lot, Alice. I'll try to show my slides. And hi, everyone. So I'm delighted to be here to speak about this new agreement on fisheries subsidies. And so what I'll try to do is to provide you with a concise overview of what was agreed. So let's start with the scope of this new treaty. And so in terms of scope, the new agreement applies to specific subsidies provided to marine wild capture fishing and fishing related activities that take place at sea. Specific subsidies here means that economy-wide subsidies that benefit all economic sectors are not covered. And based on this scope, the agreement does not cover subsidies to aquaculture, to inland fishing, so lakes, rivers, and also the subsidies to any onshore activities, for example, onshore processing. So that's for the scope. But what are the actual rules? So what I've provided you with on this slide is a simple overview of the structure of the new rules. And you can see that there are three pillars, three areas in which new rules have been agreed. The first one is a prohibition to subsidize fishing vessels and operators engaged in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, IUU fishing. The second one is a prohibition to subsidize the fishing of stocks that are in an overfished condition, meaning that their level of biomass is alarmingly low. And the third area, the third pillar, regroups three rules. So these include a prohibition to subsidize fishing in the unregulated high seas. And it also includes obligations to show particular caution when providing subsidies in two situations. First, when the subsidizing vessel does not fly the flag of the subsidizing member. And second, when the status of fish stocks is unknown because they are unassessed. And the agreement also includes a number of more horizontal provisions that relate to special and differential treatment for developing countries, including technical assistance, but also transparency and institutional issues. So that's the overall structure. And let's now look into these rules in just a bit more detail, starting with the rule that apply to subsidies to IUU fishing. Here, the main rule is a prohibition to provide any subsidy to fishing vessels or fishing operators that are subject to a determination of IUU fishing. So in other words, this means that they've been found to engage in IUU fishing, and as a result, it's forbidden to subsidize them or any of their support activities. The determinations which trigger the subsidy prohibition can be made by coastal states for IUU activities in their waters, but also by flag states for IUU activities by vessels that fly their flag, and by regional fisheries management organizations for IUU activities under their competence. So that's a pretty strict prohibition, but to trigger the subsidy prohibition, determinations of IUU fishing must meet some simple criteria that relate to the evidence that was used and the procedures that were followed for the IUU determination process. So that's to ensure that unfair IUU determinations do not end up triggering the subsidy prohibition. It's also worth noting that in applying the rules, the subsidizing member needs to modulate the duration of the prohibition based on the seriousness of the IUU activity. And developing countries benefit here from a 2 years grace period for the activities that occur in their waters. So that means that the rule applies from day one to them, but it cannot be enforced through dispute settlement for those activities for a period of 2 years. And finally, there's also an additional obligation on IUU, which in essence says that when a WTO member receives a notification from a port state about suspected IUU activity by one of its vessels, then this member must give due regard to that information and take the actions it feels are appropriate regarding its subsidies. Moving to the second pillar of the new rules, subsidies to the fishing of overfished stocks. Here, the rule is again a subsidy prohibition, but this time applying to fishing activities for stocks that are recognized as overfished. So those are stocks for which it's considered that the biomass is alarmingly low, too low, and they must be rebuilt. So the assessment that triggers this subsidy prohibition can be done by a coastal state for the stocks in its waters. And again, it can also be done by a regional fisheries management organization for the stocks that fall within its competence. This prohibition is again quite strict, but there is an important flexibility, which you see here at the bottom of the box. So if the subsidies themselves, or if other fisheries management measures are implemented to rebuild the overfished stocks to a healthy level, then subsidies are still allowed. And here, just two additional elements to mention. The first is that the assessment of stock status must be based on the best scientific evidence available to the coastal state or to the RFMO that makes this assessment. And second, like for the IUU rule, there is a 2-year grace period for fishing activity by developing countries in their own waters. So again, the rule applies, but it cannot be enforced through dispute settlement for that period and for those activities. Turning now to the third substantive pillar of the new rules, here there are 3 different rules. The first one is a prohibition to provide any subsidy to fishing activities on the unregulated high seas. So in other words, that covers situations where there is absolutely no conservation or management measures in place because there is no real management competence over those fisheries. And the 2 following rules are not as strong as a prohibition, but they both follow the same principle. And so what they do is that they introduce an obligation to give special care and to exercise due restraint when providing subsidies in 2 situations. The first situation is when the subsidized vessels do not fly the subsidizing member's flag, which may mean that the subsidizing member has no sort of control or responsibility over this vessel's activities. And the second situation is when the fish stocks are not assessed and their status is unknown. So we have no idea on whether they are healthy or depleted. So if you look at them together, these 3 rules, they have something in common because they all apply to situations in which, for different reasons, there's a lack of control over the impact that subsidies may have, and that makes subsidization particularly risky. So that's really what they are trying to address. A last thing to mention here is that there is no special and differential treatment for these rules, but there is an exception that applies to all WTO members. And this exception is for subsidies that are specifically for disaster relief. The new agreement also includes provisions on transparency. And here, the innovation is that WTO members will need to notify fisheries-related information. So WTO members already had an obligation to notify their subsidies, including fisheries subsidies, but with the new agreement, they will need to include information on the fisheries they subsidize in those notifications. So this should include, at the very least, information on the type or kind of fishing that's subsidized. And if possible, it should also cover information such as stock status, management measures, fleet capacity, the identification of subsidized vessels, as well as catch data. There's also an obligation to notify the list of IUU determinations that are made by a member, as well as its membership in RFMOs, and an obligation to provide information on the fisheries regime of each member and the measures it's been taking to implement the agreement. Finally, there's also a number of provisions that relate to least developed countries and to technical assistance. So regarding LDCs, the agreement simply provides that members must exercise due restraint in raising matters that involve LDCs, and they must look for solutions that take into consideration LDC's particular situation. And on technical assistance, the agreement provides that targeted technical assistance and capacity building shall be provided to developing countries, to support the implementation of the agreement. And regarding this, it also provides for the establishment of a specific fund for this, so a WTO fisheries funding mechanism that will be funded by voluntary contributions by WTO members. So that concludes the overview of what is in the agreement, but some provisions were also left out of the agreement at the Ministerial. So if you look at the text that was on the table at the beginning of the Ministerial and you compare it to the final text, there are a number of elements that did not make it into the final agreement. And the most important of these by far is here what you have on this slide. And that's an additional and marginal prohibition of subsidies that contribute to overfishing and overcapacity, which included a list of specific types of subsidies. So you see on the slide that this list included things like subsidies related to fuel, but also to capital costs like vessels or engines, as well as subsidies targeted at fishing beyond the subsidizing members' waters. So these subsidies were to be prohibited, unless the subsidizing member could show that management measures are in place to keep stocks healthy. And that's a very similar flexibility to the one that's been agreed in Article 4 on overfished stocks. And there were also a series of temporary and permanent exemptions to this rule for developing country members. But some of the parameters of those exemptions were not decided when members arrived at MC12, so that was still on the table. This rule was considered particularly important by many delegations because of its broader and more direct nature in how it's triggered. And that's because it did not need a particular fisheries-related decision to be triggered, right? Like it's the case for the IUU subsidy prohibition, or for the overfished stocks subsidy prohibition. So why was it left out? That's because during the Ministerial Conference, members could not agree on the exact parameters of this rule, in particular with regards to the special and differential treatment exemptions. So because of this, a decision was made to go for a smaller package of rules, but we'll see on the next slide that negotiations are expected to continue on this topic. Maybe one last thing on this slide that's important to note is that those subsidies that are listed, it's not like they are not disciplined at all by the agreement. They are disciplined by the agreement to the extent they fall within the scope of the agreed rules. So, for example, if they are provided to IUU activities, or if they are provided to the fishing of overfished stocks, or to fishing on the unregulated high seas, then they are captured by the new rules and they are prohibited. Finally, a last slide to note that WTO members did not simply left that discipline out of the agreement, and that was it. They also committed to continue negotiations to achieve a comprehensive agreement on fisheries subsidies, including further disciplines on the subsidies that contribute to overfishing and overcapacity. And here, the objective is to make recommendations regarding this to the 13th Ministerial Conference. And maybe most importantly, there's also an innovative clause that was included to that effect at the end of the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement. And it provides that such comprehensive rules, if such comprehensive rules are not adopted in the 4 years that follow the entry into force of the agreement, then the agreement shall be terminated, right? So it should expire. In a sense, that's a self-destruction clause. But there is also the possibility for WTO members to decide that they would actually like to keep the agreement alive, even if they don't manage to agree on future rules. So that provision was an integral part of the compromise found by members at the Ministerial Conference, because it was particularly important for the members that were the most disappointed by the exclusion of the prohibition of subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. So the goal here was really to put real pressure on members to deliver through those future negotiations. That concludes this fairly short overview of what is a complex treaty. So I'm happy to try to clarify anything that wasn't clear and to take questions. And you also have our email addresses, and you can reach out to the team if you would like to discuss anything with us. So that's it from me. Thank you so much, and back to you, Alice.
Super. Well, thank you very much indeed, Tristan. That was a very good, clear, measured overview of what's in and what's out. Just as a reminder, there was a question in the Q&A box, which is exactly the right place to put your questions. If you have questions as we go through, please put them in the Q&A box, and we can either respond to them live or we can leave them for the discussion at the end. But don't feel you have to keep them all until the very end. Please put them in the box. One of them was whether we're going to be circulating the slides of these presentations, and we will, to everybody who's registered. So if you didn't catch every detail, you will have the slides. So Tristan, that was super helpful. Thank you very much. I think it set the scene for what we're talking about in this agreement. And I'd now like to hear from Isabel Jarrett. Isabel, you've been following these negotiations for many years, and you've been deeply involved both in the technicalities and also in the difficult politics of them. So what's your assessment of how far members got?
Thanks, Alice, and thanks to ISD for inviting me to provide some additional views on what was agreed a few weeks ago in sweltering Geneva. Sorry to hear that it's still sweltering at MC12. Perhaps just to introduce myself and a little bit about Pew. As Alice said, my name is Isabel Jarrett, and Pew has been engaged on this issue for the last 4 years, so not as long perhaps as Alice or Rashid or even Tristan, or maybe John. I don't know how long you've been working sort of in and off and on subsidies, but so we're by no means we're by no means the longest standing organization who's been working on this issue, but we have been working intensely on this issue for the last 4 years. And Pew is an international non-profit organization with a significant environmental conservation portfolio. And we've worked for many years on trying to improve fisheries management at the international level, as well as working to protect important marine habitat. So it made a lot of sense for us to engage on this issue when governments agreed to the UN Sustainable Development Goals back in 2015, because that provided, after nearly 20 years of negotiations, provided new impetus, after nearly 15 years of negotiations, provided new impetus to discussions. And we felt that that was an important point for us to engage. Now, I'll get into where, how we see what was agreed. But I think Tristan asked me before this webinar, he said, Isabel, can you please say why is this? Can you please tell us a little bit why this agreement is important for ocean conservation? So I wanted to actually start by saying, Alice has kind of touched on it, and I'm sure Rashid will, but I think it's really important to remind everybody, including myself, why the ocean is important to us before I begin to even talk about why is this important to ocean conservation? Because why are we even trying to bother doing anything to help the ocean? Why does it matter? So, of course, as Alice mentioned, jobs. There's tens of millions of people employed directly in the fisheries supply chain. I'm just talking about fisheries here, directly by fisheries. And then there's another hundreds of millions of people employed throughout the fisheries supply chain. So we know it's really that a healthy ocean with healthy fish stocks is really important for jobs. Alice also mentioned food security. We know that for much of the world's population, fish are a key source of protein for many coastal communities around the world. And then we also know that, and it's not lost on me that we're all meeting today and discussing the heat wave that's touching parts of Europe and of course London, that the ocean has an important role in climate change, in combating climate change, and in and our role is to ensure that the ocean remains resilient as possible. And that includes in maintaining a healthy ecosystem, maintaining healthy fish populations. We know that we're going to need the ocean increasingly in our fight against climate change. So there's all these services that the ocean provides, and it's up to us to ensure that we actually help keep the ocean healthy. So I think it's really important for us to have that in the back of our minds as we discuss fisheries subsidies, because of course, fisheries subsidies, harmful fisheries subsidies, are a key driver of overfishing, which is perhaps the biggest threat to marine environments around the world, the global marine environment. So we know, and governments have long known, that they need to combat overfishing, and that one of the ways they can do that is through combating harmful fisheries subsidies. So I've touched on the fact that, okay, these negotiations have been going for 20 years, but I do think it's worth emphasizing in this broader context of ocean conservation that, yes, the negotiations have been going on for 20 years, but what we know today, and hopefully Rashid will touch on this a little bit, what we know today is far more than what negotiators knew in 2001 when they first started these discussions. We just had an estimate for fisheries subsidies on one stock in one part of the ocean. Now we have global estimates of harmful fisheries subsidies, and we also have not just that information on fisheries subsidies, on what the potential benefits of reform are, but this comes in a much broader context of a greater understanding of the potential harms to our marine environment and how we can improve fisheries management, for example. So all of this to say that I'm trying to put this into a bit of a broader picture for everybody so that you can see that fisheries subsidies is one part of the puzzle to ensuring that we have a healthy ocean. Now, before I go into our view of the treaty, I also want to make another point about context, which Alice touched on, but I'll take it a little bit further. These negotiations at MC12 came at a very politically difficult moment in world politics, in the geopolitical context. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, the multiple delays of MC12 due to COVID, amongst many other issues, as well as the fact that the negotiators themselves are dealing with two very politically sensitive issues. So I think it's important to remember that context, plus the fact that we need 164 members to agree by consensus to whatever's on the table in order to reach an agreement, to recognize that. And when we see this agreement, because it really is a significant achievement in those two contexts of kind of the broader ocean conservation and the political context, to know that this really was a significant step forward. And that's exactly how Pew has chosen to, that's our assessment of the agreement. It's a significant step forward, but it's by no means everything that we would want to see. As Tristan pointed out, there are some elements of the treaty that simply could not be agreed to, of the draft treaty text that simply could not be agreed to at MC12. And I think it is important to note the role of politics in that, but also to note that, as Tristan explained, there's an opportunity to improve the treaty going forward. And I think that's really important, because some of the options that were on the table for the Article 5, for those areas that Tristan mentioned, dealing with overfishing, overcapacity, were exceptions that would have weakened the rules to such an could have weakened the rules to such an extent that it wouldn't have been an achievement to have reached to agree to a rule that had 25-year exception to it. 25 years is a generation, and so we know that we need even developing countries to try to tackle their harmful subsidies to commercial fisheries within a much shorter period of time. So I think that while I want all of us to be having a nuanced conversation about what this agreement means, I want to ensure that the flaws and the weaknesses in the agreement don't distract from the actual opportunity that this agreement presents. So it presents two opportunities. One, as I've just described, there is this opportunity that's been written into the draft treaty text to change, to create rules on overfishing, overcapacity that build on what's already in the text. That's really important. And secondly, this is an opportunity that we've never had before. We've never had global rules, global binding rules on fisheries subsidies. We've never had a treaty at the WTO that deals with sustainability. And this really opens the door for organizations like Pew, ISD, other organizations, multilateral agencies, governments, to be having a dialogue about what they're doing with their taxpayers' money. I think it's really worth emphasizing that actually we're talking about how taxpayers' money is spent, on the environment, on damaging the environment. And it's worth saying that what often happens is taxpayers are paying twice. We're paying first to subsidize the destruction of the environment, and then we're often paying again to enhance, to solve those problems on the of the destruction of the environment. So really, we've never had an opportunity at a global scale for organizations, for multiple members of the stakeholder community to be able to have conversations with governments about how they're spending taxpayer money and what they're doing to, yes, support their coastal communities, but also to support the environment. So I think that that's really important, even if there's bits of the draft text that that weren't agreed to. We still have the opportunity, the door is still open with governments to have these vital conversations. And so any criticism of the agreement should also consider that we have this opportunity that we've never had before. And so that brings me to a point I'd like to make about the work is not yet done, which of course, as somebody who's been working on this for 4 years, I'm sure Alice feels very tired too. You think, oh, I thought, reaching a treaty would be it. No. We need to have 109 members ratify the agreement before it enters into force. But we also really need, as a stakeholder community, to be thinking about implementation of the agreement, which I'm looking forward to hearing John talk about. We really need to ensure that we have stakeholders in a position to help support governments to do that. And then the other point that I'd like to make is we've talked a lot, we obviously talked about the WTO, what these rules mean, but let's look at the broader context once again. We have other ongoing discussions about how to tackle environmental problems going on as we speak. So in the last 2 weeks of August, we have governments, the same governments who've reached an agreement at the WTO, meeting in the context of the UN to discuss a possible high seas treaty. Can the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement be a catalyst for reaching that treaty where discussions have been ongoing for many, many years also? I've talked about how governments have managed to reach a treaty in a politically difficult context. Surely this sets a blueprint or helps set a standard for governments to do something similar in another context. And likewise, we have governments meeting at the Convention on Biological Diversity, where they've been discussing how to tackle more broadly environmental harmful subsidies. Now, fisheries subsidies are just a drop in the ocean of environmentally harmful subsidies. But can governments set some commitments to begin to tackle those other environmentally harmful subsidies later this year in November when they meet at that convention, that meeting? And then lastly, of course, this hasn't been mentioned, I don't think, by Alice or by Tristan, is what does the Fisheries Subsidy Agreement mean for the WTO tackling other sustainability issues, which are increasingly going to be important for the WTO and for us going forward. So there's ongoing discussions about fossil fuel subsidies and about plastics, to give you 2 examples. And does this help set a precedent, an important precedent for the WTO to tackle other issues of environmental significance going forward? And I'll stop there. Thanks, Alice.
No, thank you, Isabel. And I think on your last point, I think you're exactly right. It does, right? And this is a fact that's not lost on any of the negotiators who we speak to frequently. And the other point that I think when we speak to many of the negotiators here, they very much or at least all of those who we've spoken to, very much see this as the first step in a long process of work, right? This is, you know, in a sense, finishing the treaty was the end of the beginning, right? It was, and this is now the beginning of a process of discussion and implementation. And that, of course, is where, you know, where the treaty and the obligations actually take some life and actually start to change the direction of policy, we hope. So that was super, Isabel. Thank you very much indeed. I might turn quickly now to Rashid, because you've been following this issue for a long time. Can you give us a kind of a quick pithy summary of your assessment of what we've achieved here?
Yeah, so thank you very much, and thanks to Tristan and Isabel. We've covered the ground, so I have to find a way to make it a little bit interesting and spicy in a different way, right? Because we've really covered much. So I was asked to specifically talk about how the new rules could be strengthened, right? That was essentially the question. But before I do that, I really want to start to kind of again repeat what you've heard and the audience may have heard a number of times, why the world is keen on removing harmful subsidies. We heard that from Alice, Tristan, and Isabel already. But I just want to re-emphasize, the thing is subsidies, some of them lead to overfishing, overcapacity. In fact, fisheries are, because they are common property, because they move around, they're not as boring as trees, you know, managing them is really hard. Even without subsidies, it's hard to manage this sustainably. There's a race for the fish, there's all this, if I don't catch the fish, it's not mine, so everybody's competing. And if you put subsidies on it, it's like pouring petrol on fire, really. And that's one thing on the sustainability and environment side. The other angle, which really bothers me a lot, is the inequality part of it. It really disadvantaged people we shouldn't disadvantage in our world today, because our biggest issue, in my view, is inequality. Is the fact that big groups of the world's population are put out of the system in a way. I'm talking about developing countries versus developed countries. One estimate, for each dollar a developed country fish, I guess, for a developing country fish, I guess, a developed one gets $7. So this is completely disadvantages them, both on the water and in the market in terms of competition. How about women? We find that most of the subsidies goes to the large scale. Our study shows that women who participate in fishing actually are small scale. So we are aggravating inequality, which is all over the world. I mean, think of it. I saw a report where they looked at legal equality between men and women around the world, and only 6 countries actually were balanced. Only 6 in the whole world, right? So why do you want to aggravate this with public funds, you know? And you can go on and on. The youth. So there is that part, the social and equity and diversity part of things. So, and I think if you ask the fish, how wise is it for people to give subsidies that are harmful to go after the fish, their babies and the mommies and everything? I think the fish will tell you we are very dumb people. Human beings are dumb. Why will you use your scarce dollars to go and destroy the resource that feeds you, right? I'm whispering to the fish now, and they're telling me this. You guys, why do you do this? So there's all that. And so just to kind of re-emphasize why this is important. Now, before again I get to my main question, I would like to just give you, and you've read some of some quotes from me since even before the text became public. My first take is that, okay, after 20 years, and I've actually been following this for all the 20 years. It's amazing, right? And so for me, in fact, when the agreement was going, I was having a meeting, my lab meeting. You know, I couldn't go to Geneva because the bloody COVID hit me just when I was about to fly. So I couldn't come around to look into the eyes of the negotiators, and that was painful. But okay, so I was having a lab meeting with my group at UBC, and it came to a point where we thought there would be no agreement at all. And you could see how my group felt. It was really painful to think that all this effort over 20 years will lead to nothing. So, And the reason I was also worried is what it would have done to us. All the people who are putting effort, and lots of people who have put their heads on the bench, really pushing. This panel, of course, but even think of the leadership of the WTO, the Director General and the Ambassador Santiago. You can just imagine what they had to do to get this. And I think we should support our allies, frankly speaking, right? Because the more we knock off people who are wanting to do something, the more we weaken the whole world, and you see it all over. So I really think this is a good thing. And we're preparing for the UN Ocean Conference. And I asked my student, can you imagine if this were to have collapsed, the kind of cloud that would have been over the UN conference? That means the world cannot agree on anything, not even the most minimum thing. So in general, I see this to be a positive thing. Now, having said that, you've already heard there are problems, and you've heard me talk about this in the press. The big one, if you're going to strengthen this, and the WTO knows this, they've put some of them already on the agenda for NC13. The big one is the overcapacity and overfishing subsidies. So I really hope we can push and get something down. Why do I say that? From what has been agreed, like the IUU fishing and also the overfish talk, to me it's like waiting for something to happen and you try to cure it. So we are not doing the prevention. Once the fish is down, then don't give the subsidy, but we want to do this before. So that's how I see the overfishing, the overcapacity. So it's really crucial. Prevention is better than cure. This is what we're told since we were kids, right? So it's important to do that. So that's one thing. I hope the negotiators will take on. They've already said they will do it. We got to put the pressure on the academia, the civil society, everyone. We need to have that. So that's one. Number two, the unregulated and the high seas is good. There's something there. What I'm not sure about is really how big this is. You know, and I'm trying to get the area of RFMOs and non-RFMOs and so on, just to have a true scientific feel of what this actually means, right? Now, if I was the one managing this, I would just eliminate subsidies to the high seas for all sorts of good reasons, but I'm not a politician, right? so they do their thing, but frankly speaking, because if you think of it, remember our study with Enric Sala, where taking subsidies, harmful subsidies from the high sea, it's like close to 50% of the high sea. 54% of the fishing grounds will not be fishable profitably, right? And we also know the inequality there. Few countries take all the benefits, and if we did this, just take out the subsidies. So if you want to know my second request to this to the negotiated in MC13, that is the one. Now, number three, the sunset clause. The way it is set up, I would do the opposite actually, because what the sunset clause is saying, and we can debate this and you can correct me, is that if in 4 years you don't do something, the whole thing just dies. I would say that if in 4 years you don't get anything done, all the outstanding clauses will come into force. You see what I'm doing here? Because those who don't like it will just let it collapse, right? They don't want even the little we got. But if it is the opposite, like you either get an agreement or, you know, I'm playing with game theory here. I hope you get that. So reverse the sunset thing and say, you either get an agreement or we do the thing you don't want to happen. You know, so that's again. Now on research and capacity building, I think to implement this, and I know John, this is your area, but I really think that we need to invest more in research and capacity building, because how are we to know which are the IUU fishing boats, which stocks are overfished, right? Thinking of developing countries, so lots of investment is needed, and we need finance. That's what I'm talking about here in Kigali, actually. We're talking about protected areas, African Protected Area Congress, UCN, and we'll have, tomorrow will be a day for financing. And so yeah, so that is that. And in conclusion, I think like Isabel, all of you have said, it's good we have an agreement, in my view, because the reverse would have been very disarming, discouraging, and inspiring. It would just slow us down. At least we have something. Let's improve it. It's not what we want, but hey, the world is, you cannot go to sleep, right? That's what this means. This is just the beginning. We gotta work until we see what is good for the ocean and therefore good for us. So we'll get infinity fish, right? Infinity
And a
ocean.
perfect plug. A perfect plug for your book, Rashid.
There you go, Alice. Yeah, there you go.
That was super. Yes, Rashid has a book out called Infinity Fish, which you might want to buy. It's excellent.
Yeah, and all the best. Yeah, thank you. That's it.
That was super, Rashid. Thank you. I just want to introduce one clarification before we move to John, because the way the sunset clause works, and there was one question about this in the Q&A as well, is that the 4 years only starts ticking when the agreement enters into force. So when 109, 2/3 of WTO members have ratified it and it is binding on them and is implemented, then the 4 years starts to tick. And I think the thinking behind that is that once that investment is made, members will be much more likely to want to keep the agreement in place because they've already gone through the process of ratifying it. So it's all designed, I think, as Tristan was saying, to increase the incentives to get the last bits included into the agreement. So anyway, with that very quick clarification, I'll turn now to you, John. You're an expert on all things fisheries. What do you make of this agreement?
Thank you. I'll just share my screen and hopefully that is now visible for everybody.
Yep, that's perfect. Go ahead.
It's a very important agreement. It's one that has been needed for a long while. Some of the work we've done in the past, and that's included work with Rashid, has been looking at where subsidies have been put in place and where they're most damaging. And one of the critical things was not even having the information available to do some of that analysis, not being able to estimate where the fisheries were impacting on overfished or overcapacity stocks already. We didn't know that information. That information just was not available. And some of the work we did get through in West Africa was showing that the key stocks out there are already overfished. Well, there are also those stocks that have the biggest subsidies from foreign fishing fleets. So it's critical that this agreement comes into place and is ratified by, the 2/3 of the membership as soon as possible. Because at the moment, we've got an agreement that doesn't do anything because it's not in place. And knowing how long the FAO Port State Measures Agreement took to actually get ratified finally, and that didn't need as many as 2/3 membership. We could be waiting a few years yet before we've got something that's got its, got its teeth, shall we say, to actually do any good. So what I'm going to look at here is when it does come into force, and in quite a lot of cases before it comes into force, what do members need to do? What do countries need to do to actually make the agreement work? So first, we're looking across 3 separate areas. The first one is to establish information gathering and transparency within your own countries and also in sharing that information. So that's collecting and recording information on the fisheries subsidies that are in place, where those fisheries operate, where those fleets that are being subsidized actually fish. Is it in your own waters? Is it on the high seas? Is it in these unregulated areas, which there aren't many of in terms of the big fisheries, but they can be quite critical? Is it in the waters of RFMOs or in other coastal states EEZs where you are licensed to fish? So it's getting all that information together. We also need to look at establishing rules and procedures regarding prohibited subsidies. So when a subsidy is shown to be linked to illegal fishing, or to overfishing. How can we stop it? How do we make sure that that does not happen again? That it's just not transferred across to another vessel that's going to do the same thing and it just repeats around in a circle. How do we make sure that goes done? And that's down to each individual country, because the legal systems will all be different. But also establishing coordination mechanisms between agencies. So this is sharing information within country, between countries and RFMOs, and between all partners involved and the WTO. We need to establish those processes to make sure that information can be transferred, so that it doesn't take 2 years to send a list of illegal vessels to a coastal state so that they take action, or to a flag state on their own vessels that needs to take action. So it's having these processes in place. Now, I know I've not got much time, so what I'll do is I'll just go through 2 simple examples of what might be needed with these 3 areas. First one was an IUU subsidy prohibition. So what information do we need to gather? Well, I've already said we need to collect and record information on all the subsidies and all the fleets. Who gets a subsidy? But also what those fleets are doing. What are they targeting? What fish are they fishing for? Where are they fishing? But then collecting, recording all relevant cases of IUU fishing. Remembering this is not just illegal, it's unreported fishing as well. So if they're misreporting catches, that's still IUU. If they're fishing in an unregulated fashion, for instance, in the I noticed before in the Q&A a question about the Southwest Atlantic. So if you're fishing in the Southwest Atlantic for bottom fish, not for tuna, which will be covered by ICAT, are you unregulated, or are you regulated by your flag state in such a way that you can demonstrate actually we're acting responsibly? Bit of a grey area, but we've got to collect and record all that information. Similarly, we've got to produce rules and procedures. So these are laws, regulations, procedures that might need to be introduced, brand new ones that link to this agreement, or current ones that can be changed and added to allow that. What do those laws need to do? Well, they should ban IUU vessels and operators from receiving subsidies. It's critical we act on the operators as well to make sure that they don't just move all their effort to another boat or new boats. Also removing a subsidy if guilty. If a boat's found to be fishing illegally, well, you stop its subsidy right away. You don't delay. But there may be the possibility of recouping that, that payment that's been made to them. If they've been acting illegally, there should be a law, a regulation in place that says when you're granted a subsidy, you won't act in an illegal fashion. You won't misreport or underreport your data. Then you can recoup that subsidy back from that vessel or that operator. It's an important thing. Where all fisheries departments are stretched for cash. They always are. I think Rashid, mentioned we're desperate for money to do the simple management tasks, especially developing countries. And if money can be recouped from that, great. And then we've got some, and these are illustrative coordination mechanisms, because every country will be set up differently. There'll be different names, but the same tasks will be done. They'll just be done by a different ministry or a different department or an NGO in some cases, or a quasi-governmental organization. But simply all IUU judgments will be notified from, in this case, the Ministry of Justice. Whoever performs the act of saying you are illegal would actually notify the Ministry of Fisheries, so that they can check that list of licensed and subsidized vessels and operators and ensure that the next stage of stopping the subsidy and recouping the money potentially is done. The Ministry of Fisheries then will recover that subsidy and will inform back to the Ministry of Justice that it's been done, inform Ministry of Trade that this has been done, to make sure that it doesn't happen again, and whoever issues the subsidies doesn't do that, if that's the Ministry of Trade or the Ministry of Finance or whoever. And then that same ministry or the Fisheries Ministry or the Justice Ministry, whoever that country decides is the lead with the WTO on this agreement, will notify the WTO when that sanction's been applied. It's important, and it's written into the agreement that that should take place. Similarly, when we look at an overfish stocks prohibition, we're collecting similar information. We're collecting information on subsidies, the fleets, the vessels in those fleets, the operators, and the target species, importantly here. We're looking at what species are actually being fished. We're looking at their stock status. We're flagging any stocks that are overfished. We then have a similar set of rules that match up those vessels that are fishing with subsidies on those fleets. And there will be a similar law or regulation or procedure to say, no, 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 we can't actually subsidize you anymore because you're fishing that stock. We'll have to remove it. Okay. And then similar coordination mechanisms, identifying those overfished stocks from the Fisheries Science Department or the fishing authority, or it might be an RFMO who does the stock assessment because they're shared stocks and they may need to do it in that manner. They identify those stocks, and if there aren't management measures in place, remove them. If there are management measures in place that, and we can see that there's overfishing still taking place, remove the subsidy. And then a similar notification process to notify all the different departments that are involved, notifying WTO to say this has happened. And this could always include other countries. If you're subsidizing a fleet of your flag state that is fishing in a coastal state that has overfished stocks, they will notify you that it's overfished. You then remove the subsidy from your own fleet. All these things on these past two slides can be put in place now. We don't have to wait for the agreement to be put in place. In fact, we shouldn't wait. They need to be put in place before the agreement comes into effect. So when it does, you're ready to go. Everybody is ready to go. And it's important that we do this correctly. We make it effective and efficient so we don't waste money. So what we need to do is strengthen our fisheries management, as Rashid mentioned, increase our monitoring within countries, because then we know what's going on. We'll know which stocks are overfished. We'll know better when illegal or underreporting is taking place or unreporting is taking place. So we'll be able to act. It's important that we understand that support from other bodies is important here. New agreements like this and the Port State Measures Agreement that came in recently do generate publicity in the fisheries world and in the trade world, particularly for this case. So they attract discussion, they attract support. There will be, hopefully, money available, particularly for developing countries and least developed countries, small island developing states that have critical problems in these areas, to be able to put mechanisms, modify their legal procedures, put all those critical elements into place. And where you can show that it's working, donors are always happy to fund. Donors fund success. But if they see that there's a country where things don't work, they're less likely to do it. So if we can show success either on a country or a regional level, donors will go to that region. And then we can say, look, this is what's worked. And then we're looking at good practice. I don't use the phrase best practice here because there's no one best practice. Every country is different. So one country's best practice might not work, but there are elements of good practice. Donors listening to support needs. If they listen to what's actually needed and fund that, great. If they just say, well, we've got funds for this, and you go, well, that's not what I need, the money's not going to get used properly. Also, government departments working together, not hiding data away. It's one of the critical things I found in a lot of countries where information and data are hidden away and are preserved by one ministry or one department, and they don't want to share it. This agreement relies on sharing of information, both within country, with neighbouring states, within an RFMO framework. It's critical. It's good to show small steps and continued progress rather than trying to do it all at once. This again will encourage donors. So look, we've managed to do this bit. We've redone this law. We've managed to do this and be able to demonstrate that. That's critical. But also using publicly available resources and tools. And I know there's a tool being developed through ISD to be able to do that. And I think I've just gone over my time, but
you've done very well.
It's the heat. It makes me go quickly as well. And again, open to questions. Thank you.
That's super, John. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm conscious we're a couple of minutes over time. But we have actually managed, I think, through most of us to answer a number of questions that have come up in the Q&A box. So thank you very much for those of you who put questions there. I hope we've managed to respond to most of them. As John said, ISD is developing a comprehensive self-assessment tool that governments are going to be able to use to assess their alignment of their current policies with the new rules and to think about where they may need to change their policies and what help they might need to do. They might need to do that. And so the very last point perhaps to make, and Isabel very rightly underlined this, is that essentially what governments need to do next is to accept the agreement, which is their formal international treaty step of agreeing to be bound by these new obligations. And it's only once 2/3 of the membership have taken that step that the agreement begins to be binding on those that have accepted it. So members really have a lot of flexibility in deciding when to ratify. We very much hope they do so quickly so that a lot of this technical assistance and funding can see the light of day and can contribute to the ratification process. But I think it's also important to make sure that in doing so, as John has said, they're taking initial, even small steps to begin to implement the agreement. So I don't want to keep people too long over time. I know that many of you will have things to get to at 4 o'clock. If there are any emergency questions or real points of important quick clarification that you might want to make, I'd like to give you the chance to do so, but otherwise I think we've answered most of the questions that we had come in, 13 or so of them in the Q&A box. I can't see anything, any burning questions at this point. But thank you. I think there's what we have, I think, in the questions in the Q&A box, and also from many of the exchanges that we've had with you through the chat as well, is that we have, I think, a good range of answers to most of the questions that have come up. I hope you did also take a note in Tristan's last slide of our email addresses. The ISD team is here, and essentially our job is to make sure that people understand what's in the agreement and know how to access support to begin to implement it and eventually to ratify it. So again, you will all receive copies of the slides that have been displayed today. If you didn't catch all of the details, don't worry, you'll have them in your inbox. And the last point to make from a sort of administrative perspective is we'd be very grateful for your feedback on this webinar. It's very important to us that we are meeting the needs that everyone has to understand what's in the agreement, and that we're pitching the content of it correctly so that we can make sure it's easy to follow and understand and therefore is useful. So you'll be getting a link to a feedback survey as well in your in the email that gives you the slides. So thank you very much all of you for joining us. Thank you very much for those who put questions in the Q&A box. If we didn't manage to get to all of them, please do send them to us by email, and we'd be delighted to set up phone calls to talk through some of the nuances with you. Other than that, thank you very much to all four of our speakers. They were all fantastic contributions, and I think really helped to give a sort of multifaceted, multi-dimensional perspective on what is, again, a really remarkable achievement in international trade and international environmental governance. So the next job is to make sure that it all gets implemented. And that's, of course, the bigger job. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and of course to Pew and others who funded us with their support. So thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the afternoon.
Bye-bye, everybody. Yes, bye.